I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, I'm Steve.
Hello, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. Cara, would you introduce the episode, please?
Yeah, so today we have the opportunity to talk with Jeremy Waldridge, and he's the Executive Director of Pure Life Alliance and has over a decade of experience in leading men out of the crippling effects of shame and addiction.
And we do want to say up front, because we are talking about topics of sexual addiction, sexual brokenness, and fortunately issues of hope and recovery. Anyway, we just do want to put a little warning out there. This is pretty PG-13 conversation, and so just listen wisely, and probably not a conversation to include your kids in. So thank you.
So we really hope you enjoy this conversation and that it is an encouragement to you.
Today on the Innkeepers podcast, we have the opportunity to talk with Jeremy Waldridge, the Executive Director of Pure Life Alliance. And we are discussing issues of sexual purity, sexual brokenness, and so on today, and addiction. Jeremy, would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your ministry?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Again, my name is Jeremy. I'm the Executive Director of Pure Life Alliance. I'm the Executive Director since 2020. The ministry itself has been around since 2005. It started in a church here in Beaverton, Sunrise Church. They just started a small men's group to kind of address the area of sexual addiction, sexual purity. And they found really quickly that the group filled up, and it wasn't just their church. And so from that kind of birthed this idea of how do we build a network of churches working together to help men who struggle with unwanted sexual behaviors and to help women who've been hurt by those behaviors. And that's how Pure Life Alliance started. The founder, Blake Williams, was a part of the ministry since the beginning all the way up until 2020. And he moved back to Canada, and he kind of sought his counseling degree. And that's when I stepped in. And the reason I chose to step into this ministry is because back in 2011, that's when everything about my story came out. And Pure Life Alliance came alongside my church. They came alongside my wife, and they came alongside me. They helped me find healing. They helped me rebuild my relationship. And so I owe a ton to Pure Life Alliance. And so when I was asked to step in as executive director, it seemed like a no-brainer.
We can imagine that this sexual addiction, sexual brokenness, and so on is an issue that exists outside the church, but we know that's not true. And we think, oh, the church, the missions world, they're completely unaffected by this, but that's absolutely not true. So can you just talk a little bit about this and kind of what you're seeing in the church and missions world in terms of people coming to you?
Yeah, so our ministry primarily addresses individuals who are in the church. Barna Research came out with some studies back in 2022, just last year. They said 68% of church-going men and more than 50% of pastors are viewing pornography regularly. So it's impacting the church quite a bit.
That's a staggering number.
It is. And I think part of the issue is when we are steeped in our addiction, whatever addiction it is, in this case, we're talking about sexual addiction, it stunts us. It keeps us from living out, first off, how God designed us to be, but secondly, being able to give back to the church, help others around us. We become isolated and really self-focused. And so our hope at Pure Life Alliance is to help give freedom to the church so that the church can be free to do what God's designed it to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm guessing there isn't much research in terms of what the numbers are in the missions community, but I'm guessing that it's no different than the local church. And if anything, my guess would be it would be higher because the sense of isolation that many feel on the
Yeah.
field often leads to poor coping, behaviors, and sexual addiction is probably pretty high up on the list.
Yeah, I say anywhere where we step into areas of helping others, we put a target on our back. And so, when you're doing missional work, when you're leading at a church, this idea that I have to be perfect or I have to be the example, that begins to isolate you even more, because then when flaws come up, which they inevitably will, we hide those. And then we say, well, we should be better than that. We're the missionary. We're the church leader. We shouldn't have to deal with these problems. And then that shame begins to build. And then you isolate even more. So I would say you're right. I think the church mission field, those in leadership have a tendency to deal with this issue. I think you see it more often in those areas.
So how would you biblically define the problem of pornography and sexual sins? How would you?
Yeah, so I think one of the struggles that we have is we focus on the negative. Okay, the Bible is full of conversations around sexuality. Genesis 3 starts with defining us based on our sex, man and woman. He created them. There's something unique about how we're built individually, man and woman, that represent God. And you see sexuality taught, spoken throughout the Bible in many different ways. So I think it's really important to recognize that the sin aspect of it is really, like all other sin, stepping outside of God's design for what it is.
Yeah. So it's perhaps we know what true good sexuality is supposed to be, and anytime it's not that, it's sin.
Yeah. And I would say oftentimes it comes from utilizing anything for our own benefit rather than the benefit of others. And our sexuality was meant to be shared in a relationship setting. It's meant to be between a husband and a wife. And when we start using our sexuality just to benefit ourselves, that's when I think we go astray and we start to experience some of those consequences that come when you sin.
It's often an addiction or a problem that we associate with men, but it's not just a problem with men, is it?
No, not at all. And I think you can see that just in our current culture. But if you look back at statistics, I was reading a survey the other day where a gentleman was doing just different testing on how sexuality affects marriage relationships, affects men, affects women. And in his study, he found that 73% of the women in his study had used porn in the last month. And another statistic that I read said that 1 in 3 clicks of internet pornography is from women. So it's not, women are not, women are affected just as much as men are. It is an issue for both. And I think as our society continues to push this, do anything, feel good, do what makes you happy sentiment, you're going to continue to see both men and women dive deeper and deeper into unwanted sexual behaviors to try to seek deeper meaning.
Yeah. Again, before, as we were getting ready, we were talking about how society has normalized so much behavior that is very much used just to be off limits. There definitely were right and wrong things, and now so much of that has been removed. And just pornography, just in casual conversation, in so many TV shows and movies and so on, it's just there now. And so now it's like, oh, this is just what people do.
Yeah, that's very correct. When I do conversations at different churches, I try to not just focus on pornography, because I think when we use the word pornography only, we forget about the TV shows that we're watching, and we forget about the other things that Paul talks about, renewing of your mind. So it's anything you're putting into your mind that is going to affect you negatively in your thought process when it comes to sexuality. That's what we need to try to steer clear from.
Yeah, I would say I remember doing some research on this whole area years ago, and was thinking about how women use books, romance books, often to kind of have that same out of touch with reality view of of a relationship.
Yeah.
So just it can go in so many different directions, that we are using, like you were saying, using our sexuality just for ourselves.
Yeah.
So what is it that makes it such a secret sin that's hard for the church to address openly, and makes it hard for people to ask for help?
Is it comes down to the issue of what I like to call the Facebook problem. On Facebook, we often post things that we want other people to think about us. So when I look at John's picture and John's got the new car and his kids are all smiling and they're on vacation again, my thought process about John is he's got it all together. And unfortunately, the church has had that kind of demeanor about it long before Facebook. We get dressed up in our Sunday best and we go to church and we put on those smiley faces and we tell everyone how happy we are and life's good and last week was busy but okay. And we don't address the fact that we just got in an argument on the way over to church, or that our marriage is struggling, and so that concept of constantly trying to put forward that right face leaves us isolated. And so I think that we as a church need to, number one, start talking about things more openly. I mean, if pastors are willing to talk about sexuality as often as the Bible talks about sexuality, I don't think there would be this secrecy around this topic. And then on top of that, if we were a little bit more vulnerable, I think we would experience grace in a way that we don't get to currently. I think grace comes not just from God, but grace comes from when we are vulnerable and we share our stories and other people receive that well.
So if we came to church and instead of saying to each other, everything's fine, we actually shared, that would probably be a game changer.
Yeah. And I think that you hear that and the immediate response is, yeah, but I mean, I have 5 minutes before the singing starts and then I got to sit down. And I think it's more of a, yeah, man, I'm struggling. And can we grab coffee sometime?
Yeah.
Or, hey, man, you look a little bit down. Can you and I go chat somewhere? I think if we're a little bit more open and vulnerable, the problem with that, though, I think, is that people have done that and they haven't been met in a welcoming manner, right? And so now they've got their protection up, and that protection from being hurt is actually causing them to isolate and be more hurt. So it's a both and. We have to be ready to kind of step out and be ready for some of that. But when we do, and when it's done well, I think God's grace is really in that process.
Yeah. I think the fear of rejection's got to be really high up there. And especially then you talk about pastors or missionaries, people in ministry leadership or anyone in a leadership position, and then they want to actually be honest with someone and seek help. There's just so much fear wrapped in that because they're going to be fired. They're going to be, something's going to happen that's going to be a negative reaction, not a positive reaction.
Yeah, I was talking with a pastor the other day, and he's very open about his story. And he has a phrase he uses, and I just love it. I've stolen it, told him I was going to steal it from him because it's such a great phrase. But the fallout is worth the freedom. He says, we fear the fallout. But quite frankly, that fallout is well worth the freedom, right? There are going to be consequences to our actions. That's just how life works. But when we get on the other side of those consequences, the freedom that we have when we're completely known is it's amazing. It's well worth it.
It's a great perspective. So what are some of the repercussions of sexual sins and pornography and these things that cause that are different than others?
It's interesting. A lot of people put sexual sin on kind of this pedestal of, this is a much worse. I think that's where a lot of the shame comes from. This is a worse sin or whatnot. And I don't think that it's a worse sin in God's eyes, but I do believe Paul talks about it having worse consequences. And I think that's what you're getting at there. And I think it's because the way sex was designed was man will leave his wife and join his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So there's a oneness that happens in sexuality, whether you're being casual, whether you're not. There is a oneness that's happening there. And anytime we break that oneness, whether we're going somewhere else for sexuality, whether it's through pornography or affairs or whatever it is, when we break that oneness, we're breaking a spiritual, relational, and a physical intimacy. It's not just one thing. And so I think that's what ends up causing a lot of the shrapnel that happens when it comes to the consequences of unwanted sexual behavior.
Yeah. It is good to point out that sin is sin before God, whether no matter what you're doing, is stepping out of God's design is sin. But yeah, there is, like you said, shrapnel that happens from this kind of behavior, but it's not without hope, though.
Yeah, it's not without hope, and we certainly want to make sure that we come back to that, and we will. I'm sure several times today come back to the whole issue of hope. Yeah. I think of sexual addiction, pornography. I think about overeating. I think about things that kind of grab hold of us and are very reluctant to let go. All of us in the Northwest are very familiar with the Himalayan blackberries that grow everywhere. We don't want them to grow. They're in our gardens. They're alongside the road, and I've often thought of those blackberries and the whole issue of addictive kinds of things, whatever they might be, and how they can just kind of hang out there for a while. But if you ignore them for long, they've entangled you, and to get out is a really big deal.
Absolutely. Well, and the other part of that analogy, I think that we miss, is that those blackberries taste so good.
Oh, well, there you go. That's
and
true.
They work so well. And I think that's one of the things that people forget about sexual addiction. They go, well, why would you do that? Well, let me tell you why. I do it because it actually works. I'm stressed, and for a short time, I'm not stressed. Yeah. I'm dealing with sorrow, and for a short time, I can forget that. So one of the things we do in our groups is really try to focus not just on the behavioral aspect, because that's what gets all the attention, is this negative behavior, but addressing, what is the need that you're wanting? What is that desire that you have that this is fulfilling? Because it is fulfilling a need, and it may be fulfilling even a healthy need, but they're using unhealthy means to fulfill that need. So kind of going back to that blackberry stance is, you're needing substance, you're needing the food from the blackberry, but you're finding yourself surrounded. That's not a healthy way to get your substance right now. You're getting engulfed by that. So helping people understand, like, what is that deeper need that they're trying to fulfill with this behavior, and then how can we fulfill that need in a healthy way?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So something also happens in the midst of all this. There's a brain physiological thing that's happening in this addiction as well. Could you share some about that?
Yeah, and that's where the when I say it works, right? Because what happens is, number one, there's a dopamine release. Dopamine is used in so many different areas. It's a God-given chemical that goes into our brains that's meant to connect us to our spouses. It's meant to help us with breastfeeding or all those different things that are bonding. But it happens when we're dealing with sexual addiction as well, when we're looking at pornography, or we're masturbating, or we're doing things that will release that dopamine, and it causes the neurotransmitters in the pleasure center. It gives them rewards, and so that's what creates the initial addiction. And then if you continue that, what ends up happening is the prefrontal cortex, actually the activity there decreases. So that's the part of your brain responsible for decision making. So the longer you're stuck in this addiction, all of a sudden your ability to make healthy decisions dampens, right? Other consequences that I don't think people think about is the desensitization aspect of it. So we're seeing huge numbers of younger men who are dealing with erectile dysfunction. And I think there's not proof to this, but I believe it's directly related to the sexualized culture that we have, where you see pornography everywhere, right? And they don't always call it pornography, but sexualization of individuals everywhere. And it's causing men not to be able to perform in the way that God designed us to perform. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot going on in the brain. And when you deal with addiction, there's you're basically making connections with your neural pathways. And so part of breaking from that addiction and why it's so hard to break is because you're essentially having to rewire your brain.
Yeah. And rewire how you get pleasure.
Exactly. Well, and here's something I want to point out that I think we also miss when it comes to sexual addiction. Earlier, you said, why is it different? And I think another thing that makes it different is the fact that, he mentioned food addiction. And while, yes, we're meant to eat, that's probably a little bit closer. But many of your other addictions like alcohol and whatnot, you're not made to be an alcoholic being, but you are made to be a sexual being. So then if I'm married, how do I remove myself from sexuality cold turkey, right? There's an aspect where I have to still be a sexual being, and yet that's the area where I'm struggling. And so there's this aspect, a struggle, if you will, of, okay, I have to stop the unhealthy sexual behaviors, but I still have to engage in the healthy sexual behaviors.
Right.
And so it that's another area where it's different.
Yeah, that is makes it more complex. It's a much more complex process.
Yeah.
And it's a relational. I mean, you are hurting other people. You're hurting your spouse or your future spouse by how you're acting now and whatever way you're acting out. And and that it will affect someone else and it will affect you. I think that's another piece of it that's unique to the sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if there's a spouse or a friend or someone's like, things just don't seem to be adding up. I'm getting a sense that something is going on here. Where do they go from there? And what kind of conversations need to happen? And then how do you move forward if someone is willing? Let's say someone's willing to admit to an issue and is willing to seek help. Kind of where do you go from there?
Yeah, that's good help. So I think there's a couple different questions in that. The first is, if you know somebody or you suspect somebody, and what do you do with that? And I think the first thing is you have a conversation. I think you go into it, which is very hard, but you go into it judgment free. Because no matter how you approach it, if this really is an issue that someone's working with, there's going to be shame heaped upon shame with that. And so I think the key there is to be completely honest and yet completely full of grace. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially if it's a spouse, a hurt spouse. That's a near impossible task to ask them to do. But I would say that's the first thing, because if you confront anybody with an issue and the whole point of that is just to put them down or just to say, you're doing this, it's going to have the opposite effect. But if you can go into it and say, man, I'm seeing this in your behavior and it's changed. I'm seeing your anger rise up. I'm seeing these different aspects of your life that this isn't how you used to be. What's going on? It seems like you're staying out later or staying up later. You're on the computer longer. Is something going on? I think when we can start having the conversation, that'll at least get it started. And then to the second question, you mentioned this earlier. This is a relational issue. And so we can't fix it by ourselves. I think almost every Christian man who comes into a group will say they've tried multiple times and were successful for a short time, for 2 weeks at a time. But the reality is they need other people to come along and walk beside them. It comes down to understanding this is a discipleship issue. We need to be discipled in sexuality, and make no mistake, we are being discipled. So if we're not being discipled by our church or by our community, then we're being discipled by the world. So this is a discipleship issue. So how do we get into that area? The other aspect is those who are steeped in addiction, they don't have the muscles to reach out for community, right? They've isolated themselves oftentimes. They've compartmentalized this area of their life. And so to ask them to be open and honest in a community group setting is not necessarily healthy for them. It's also not something they're probably capable of that moment. So what we do in our support groups is help men understand how to be open and honest, and they get to practice building that muscle of community in a safe environment, so that ultimately, when they step out of the support group, they're able to take that level of honesty, level of truth back into their community.
Yeah. Okay. So then they start practicing in a small group where everybody understands the struggle more or less, and then from there grow in levels of honesty with others.
Absolutely. Yep.
So
Yep.
I would think being in this small group and them hearing other people saying, I'm broken, and just hearing that from the mouths of other people has got to be a huge impact on them as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things the enemy does is it convinces us that we're the only one. And that's where that shame comes from. I'm the only one who deals with this specific issue. And even if we go, oh, yeah, porn's all over the place. Yeah, but they don't look at this, or they haven't been a Christian as long as I have. So my issue's actually worse, or whatever. And so we get isolated no matter what the issue is. So when you come into a group and you hear other men share their stories, and you start to go, oh, he understands. Oh, he's doing the same thing. He did the same thing and he found freedom. Oh, so there's this freedom or this freeing of I'm not alone. This is a place where I can be open and honest because these men have been where I have been.
So we haven't quite touched on this yet, but my understanding is that the age of addiction to these various things is lower and lower. So, and exposure.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, you think about the exposure is really what it is, right? So if I get introduced to something at an earlier age, the chances of me getting addicted to it at an earlier age is obviously going to be exponentially larger. Our current society is doing, especially here in the Oregon area, is doing sexual education younger and younger and talking about things that we would not deem beneficial to the conversation for young kids. But guess what? It doesn't really matter what we deem because it's happening. So there's a really good book I highly recommend. It's by Julie Slattery, and it's called Rethinking Sexuality. And it talks about this conversation of the church needs to step back into the area of sexual discipleship, right? My good friend John Fort, who works with Be Broken Ministry, basically he does these parenting conferences and he'll tell parents, you have to communicate to your kids before the world communicates to them. So that means we need to be having these conversations earlier and earlier, not because we think it's right, but because we want them to hear it from us. We want them to know. And so I think that's real important. I think we need to be aware and age appropriate in our conversation. But if we're sidestepping the conversation and then they're hearing it straight from school or from their buddies at school, or at least they think they are, guess who they're going to start believing? So it's real important that we as parents are not falling into the trap of I don't want to expose them or I don't want to mess them up or whatever. And I say we prayerfully step into those conversations.
So how young is the exposure these days?
So the most common exposure to pornography, they would say, is 8 years old. That's what the statistic is. I would say it really depends. I mean, you're seeing education on the body and sexuality, at 5 and 6 years old in kindergarten, first grade. That's what they're introducing them to. Some of them are unhealthy conversations around sex.
Wow. That's crazy. So, and then are we seeing kids and teens? I mean, I'm guessing teens, but is the addiction piece, with the technology and access to phones and how is that impacting everything?
Yeah. So let me define addiction really quick in this area because I think it's important. Addiction is when we run to something that we don't want to run to, right? So I can look at pornography and not be addicted to pornography. But if I want to stop looking at pornography and I can't, guess what? That's an addiction. And so it's this aspect of not being able to stop it. I think with young kids, some of it is geared around, I'm trying to think of the right word. They're exploring. They're trying to figure out who am I in this world? What is this taboo thing that people are talking about? There's exploration there. And so that would not be necessarily addiction, but it's something we want to address. It's when they go, man, I had a rough day at school, so I'm going to come home and I'm going to look at pornography, or it's when they start using the device as a coping mechanism. And statistically, we are seeing that at a younger and younger age. I think junior high is currently where you're seeing a lot more prolonged use of pornography in those areas.
Yeah. So I'm just bringing this up because we have families serving all over the world and kids in boarding schools, and, parents need to be aware that this is an issue, perhaps even for their teenager, that they are thought maybe that is doing fine, but perhaps isn't. So just to be aware that it's becoming more prevalent. And I mean, I think globally, there's more sexualization that's happening in many cultures.
Yeah, I think where we have a tendency to fail our kids in the area of having this conversation isn't actually the conversation around sexuality, but it's the conversation around feelings. Again, back to John Fort, he's got a book called Honest Talk, and it's a book about how to have the talk with kids, but the majority of the book isn't about talking about sexuality. It's about how to talk about your feelings with kids, so kids can learn to address the feelings that they're having, identify them, and then address them. Because it's when you can't identify feelings and you can't address them that you run to something to manage them, whether that's sexuality or something else. And so if we start equipping our kids on how to deal well with their emotions, then they're going to be in a healthy state when they come across something like pornography. It's not going to be feeding or meeting a need, because there's a need, not the need's already met.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And all this conversation we've been having has been around, in essence, there's a need, and how are we meeting that need? And kids have needs, adults have needs. How are we coping and getting, this taken care of? Is it a positive or is it a negative?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, let's kind of turn the corner here and focus on the issues about restoration, forgiveness, about looking for help, seeking help, and anyway, just want to certainly highlight a message of hope. So let's talk a little bit about people seeking help, and where do they get help? How do they find help? What's worked for people, and what have you seen in others' lives?
Yeah. So I'll start with a little bit of not hope, in the sense of most guys who come to our ministry come with the concept of, okay, can you give me the 1, 2, 3 things that I need to do to kick this addiction? And so one of our first focuses is helping men understand the difference between destination thinking, okay, here's where I'm going to be, and journey thinking of, okay, this is a process that's going to take me time. And so I think the first thing to recognize, and a statement we use often, is this is a journey, not a destination. And that can feel heavy for a guy, because, we're so used to working, getting it done. Like, give me the steps, I'll do it. And sexual addiction doesn't work that way. But I would say what I have found works most for most men is building a community. I think it's entrenched in who we are as beings. God created us to be in relationship. So we have to build that relationship. And that's why our community groups or our support groups work so well, is because men are able to find and build those muscles for relationship that they may not have had just in a regular community group. So I think community is such a huge, important part of the process. We were wounded in relationships, so we're going to need relationships to find healing. That was Ted Roberts who said that. And that's what we do in our support groups, is we build that community, because guys, again, don't have those muscles. And so in the group, they get to start rebuilding those muscles of, how do I be open and honest with an individual? I think another thing that's super important is addressing the move towards. So we call it move away from behaviors, move towards behaviors, because we're trying to, again, meet a need. And so if this unhealthy behavior is meeting the need, what behavior can we replace it with? Guys come into our groups oftentimes and they've, maybe they've been there for 6 months or so. And before coming into group, they were acting out every single day.
Mhm.
And yet now they're maybe, they've had a good run of like 3 weeks, and then they fail and they come into group and they're like, man, I did this and I did this, but it's all not good because I had this one incident. And the focus is no, like, look what you did. You reached out immediately. It's been, 3 weeks. You're doing the right things, so we help them have a different perspective on, it's not just a behavioral aspect, it's a longer process. And I think we need to stop focusing on just the behavior as well. I think that's super important. What are the needs that we need? What are the move towards that we need? And then one thing we haven't talked about today is, what are our beliefs? For me personally, I struggled with what other people think about me. I have a false belief that says what you think about me says more about me than anything else. And so when something happens and you give me a dirty look for whatever reasons, maybe you're looking past me, but I see this dirty look immediately, I feel like I'm no good. And now I'm responding based on that. Well, that's a false belief, right? This need for approval, that's not a healthy need. So now I've got to start addressing my false beliefs, and beliefs are even harder because they're ingrained in us. They've grown up with us, if you will. So that's kind of the process. But when you step out of that, again, there's a level of freedom. Like back to that saying, freedom is worth the fallout. There's a level of freedom when I can be completely open and honest, when I can no longer have to worry about what movies I watch, because I don't watch those kind of movies anymore. So I'm not worried that image is going to pop up on the screen. And people go, well, you don't watch movies, that's not freedom. No, there's freedom in knowing the movies that I can watch, and I'm okay with that. So I think that's the bigger hope. More than that, this weekend, Saturday, is my 22nd anniversary. Back in 2011, my marriage was, doomed. Quite frankly, it was on its way out. And I am experiencing time with my wife that I would have never experienced because of my addiction. Right. So there is freedom and there is hope, but it takes a lot of work, and it takes a willingness to do the work.
Yeah. Before we go on, let's just pause for a second and talk about the spouse in a situation where there's a confession that has to be made, and it's, unpleasant and it's harsh, and a spouse has to hear things they don't want to hear. But then they have to deal with the fallout, and they have to make decisions and choices to move forward in the relationship. Can we just talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, that's such an important topic that I think doesn't get enough. So thank you for bringing it up. Number one, for the man who just confesses, man, there's a weight that's taken off. I have just been honest for the first time, maybe in my life, and I feel free. And my wife should love me too, because now I'm being honest like she wants me to be. The problem is that weight that I just took off my chest, I just laid it on top of my wife.
Right.
And so she's not capable, or willing at that point to even think about me, right? There is this concept that this man that I thought I knew, he's not the same man. That's not who I married. This is not what I wanted for my life. And it's because of no fault of my own. And so that's a lot to sit with. And then you put on top of that, oftentimes the woman doesn't feel like it's her story to share. So she doesn't feel like she can go to her friends because she doesn't want to, out her husband or whatever, or she can't go to the church. And then that we do the same message from the church. The man goes to the church and says, here's the thing I'm struggling with. And the church goes, great job. I'm so proud of you for coming out and being honest. And then there's not a lot of support for the spouse there. And so I think oftentimes wives can feel isolated. Yeah. Now, I think the other thing that can isolate them, which is a true statement, but it doesn't affect feelings, is my addiction actually had absolutely nothing to do with my wife, right? I was dealing with my addiction long before I met her. Yeah. So in my mind, my acting out wasn't because of anything she did. Right. But that's not how she felt.
No.
Right. There's all these thoughts of I'm not good enough. I'm not meeting his needs. I'm not, all these false things that she's having to struggle with.
Yeah.
So oftentimes when a guy seeks healing, a wife will put her hands up and say, this is your problem, go deal with it. And what that doesn't allow for is the healing that she needs, because she's been hurt and there's trauma there.
Yeah.
And studies will show that the trauma, betrayal trauma, has very similar effects as somebody who has been in war. So there's this PTSD, if you will, that is affecting the wife, where she can't regulate her emotions. She doesn't understand. One minute she wants to hug her husband, the next minute she wants to smack him, and there's all these thoughts that she doesn't understand why they're coming in that way. And so she needs to be able to find healing for herself, not to fix her husband, but to help herself become, get the healing that she deserves.
Right. And then she's just living with feelings of, can I trust him? Do I need to be suspicious? What's going on? And none of those are healthy feelings either.
Right. Well, and even if the husband from that point on continues to be 100% honest, that's not something she can trust yet. That trust has to be rebuilt. My wife's story, when she shares her story, she'll tell you that I was doing everything right, and yet she still had no marital affections for me. Like, it took God changing her heart because she was so hurt. And so I often tell guys, like, this is a process where you just need to be sitting in and praying. You do need to be doing the right things. You do need to be showing yourself trustworthy and showing that level of durability. But then you've got to trust God on that, because the truth is you have hurt your wife in a way that is unimaginable. So, but again, God loves reconciliation. God loves redeeming the lost. And so, I think more often than not, that's a story that when we sit and we wait and we pray, I think that is a story that God honors oftentimes.
Yeah.
So what would you recommend to the wife to do? There's men are supposed to find support in groups and things like that and be honest and confess. But what does the wife do? How does she get help?
Yeah, so we have a group for betrayed wives as well. It's not about finding out health for the husband, but understanding it helps me understand my part in it, which was nothing, as a spouse, as a wife. And so I can go, okay, this is how my husband got that way, so it's not a me issue. So now how do I deal with this grief that I've got of a husband who's not who I thought he was? How do I deal with this? And so our support group, Hidden Hurt, will help them through some of those processes of going through first the betrayal aspect, then into their own recovery, and then into transformation, recognizing, okay, this is who I am. Despite, I am this because God says I am, not because of anything my husband's done or is going to do.
Yeah. And just the forgiveness aspect, because the husband can be, he takes that first step. He's honest. He puts himself in an accountability group. He does, he's making all the right steps. He's honestly changed and is working towards, like you said, he's embraced the idea of the journey. But if the wife never exercises that forgiveness piece, it's devastating.
Yeah, so I would say it's twofold. Number one, I think we've often hear forgiveness is for us, not for the other person, right? So anytime we're holding on to unforgiveness, it's affecting us. But forgiveness is not a blanket, you're okay now and there's no consequences to your actions.
Yeah.
One of the things we share with the women in our program is that healthy boundaries are super important. And boundaries aren't a way to control your husband. They're a way to protect yourself.
Yeah.
And so helping them learn how to build that puts them in a place where I can forgive him because I have the boundaries, healthy boundaries around me that will protect me should this happen again. Or whatever that might look like.
Yeah, and it's you can forgive. There can be honest forgiveness, but there are still consequences.
Right.
Yeah.
What all the behaviors have been. And it takes time. Trust, you can forgive, but trust may take years to rebuild.
Yeah, the
rebuilding.
Do you kind of, I'm just thinking about the Hidden Hurt program that you mentioned for the wives. Is that also kind of a journey motif for the wife as well?
It is, and I think the journey is different because they're not dealing with an addiction, right?
Yeah.
So their journey is definitely shorter. Some of it's education, some of it's, some women who come into the program feel that there are some areas where they struggle with, setting healthy boundaries or whatever it might be. Some women have experienced a deeper level of trauma, and so getting that trauma figured out and being able to address that trauma takes longer. So I think it's different, but it is very much a community aspect. It is I'm not in this alone. I don't need to keep my husband's secret in this sense. I have a group of people that I can share what's going on, and they can tell me, you might double check on that, or no, your husband's trying based on this, and this, or whatever. They can help, regulate those emotions.
Okay.
So here's a little something. What if the wife is the one that has found out the husband acting out, but the husband hasn't, and then he's never actually come forward and confessed? How does that affect things?
Well, I guess let me ask a clarifying question. Has she confronted the husband?
Yes.
Okay, so the issue is known and he's not being open and honest about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the wife, if he is steeped, we're talking from a Christian's perspective, right? So we're going to assume that these individuals are Christian, and this is a issue that he's struggling. If he's struggling and sticking in this issue, I would say it's because the pleasure of the issue is greater than the pain of the issue, right?
Yeah.
Has cost him enough. And that doesn't mean that's her place to do, but her place is to protect herself. And so if she is in a relationship where he is not protecting the relationship, then she needs to begin to protect herself or her family. And what does that look like? Well, maybe that looks like, hey, if you're not willing to dive into this issue, we might need to be separated for a while. Or what does that look like? So I think, again, it comes back to helping empower the spouse to set healthy boundaries, to make sure she's protecting herself. And then with that, hopefully he will go, oh gosh, I might lose my wife over this, and that's not worth it. Hopefully that's the case. I wish that there was a better way for men to, or anyone, to come out of brokenness before it gets too dark. But unfortunately, I think that is what we tend to see.
So I want to shift this a little bit, because a lot of what you do is work here in the Northwest, and people can go to groups and whatnot, but we have people listening all over the world, and maybe they don't have access to a small group, or they're the missionary and they are really afraid of the fallout and how this may mean they have to leave the field. Like, what would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, first, I think that's two different things. So number one, there are a number of amazing organizations out there just like us. Many of them might have online groups or resources available for people who are in the mission field or who are overseas or in another state. And so there are a plethora of resources. A really good one I highly encourage, because they have in my opinion, they have their fingerprint on multiple organizations, is an organization called Be Broken Ministries. And so if you are not in the Pacific Northwest and you want to know where, they have ways of helping you find groups all over.
That's great.
Yeah, Be Broken Ministries, amazing. Anyhow, but for the missionary specifically, for individuals, again, let me put it this way. We have group leaders, right, who go through our training program and lead our groups. And I would love to say that once you've been through our program and become a leader, you are going to be amazing for the rest of your life in the area of biblical sexuality. But that is not the truth.
Right.
So we have leaders who experience a relapse. And so we have a couple options there. we can say, buck up, man, you know what to do, figure it out. I need you still to lead that group because we're a ministry. And like all ministries, we need leaders, which I think would be super unhealthy for both that leader and that group. The next option is to say, man, you don't have this figured out yet. We need you to just step away and, come back to us when you've got it figured out, which again, I don't think helps that individual. So what we've chosen to do is we do ask them to step down for a time. And during that time, we ask them to focus on their marriage and get counseling and stay connected to their group. Mm-hmm. Right? We don't separate them from their group because that is their community. So even though they were the leader, now they're stepping into a role that's not a leader for a time. It gives them the ability to say, oh, this organization cares more about me and my marriage than they do about me as a leader for their organization. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to start thinking in that capacity for our missionaries. Yes, we want to get the word out to every single person, but Jesus cared for that one sheep as well. And so if I have an individual in the field who is hurting, I need to care for him first than I do anyone else, right? So I need to address that. So I'm going to bring him back and I'm going to say, listen, you are going to step down, but not because you're not capable, but because we care about you and we want you to get the help that you need. And then when you are ready, you will step back into a leadership role.
Yeah. This conversation has been really rich. But I just feel like I need to ask, what if we know that we have people listening that are directly involved in mission agencies and overseeing missionaries. And if they don't have, how would you just talk to them in terms of, I hate to use the word policy, but procedure, but if a missionary, how do they create an open door for a missionary to come to them and admit an addiction and, but without the fear of what's going to happen to me?
Well, my guess is if they don't currently have a DNA of being open and honest about sexuality, then it's going to take time. It's going to take time to rebuild that process because many organizations, they take the stance of, I don't have time to deal in that. So if they're not able, then we're just going to move them out and get the next person in, which is, I think, very short-sighted.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of work to bring that guy back. Well, if you were to help that individual find the healing they need, get them connected, stay connected to them, check back with them, when they are ready and go back in the field, how much more powerful are they going to be for God when they have gotten healthy and gotten help, and they know that this organization cares for them? So I think that if we can take a longer viewpoint and say, no, if I am going to disciple this individual in the area of, and just back to missional aspect, if I'm going to send somebody into the field, I'm going to tell them about the area. I'm going to tell them about the language. I'm going to help them understand the culture, right? I'm going to put that effort into them. I need to do the same in the area of sexuality. I need to make sure that they are in a place that they need in order to help others.
Okay. It sees them as a whole person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is something that a lot of organizations are growing in and seeing the missionary themselves as just as important as the work that they do.
Right.
Yeah. If they're not talking about human sexuality in a marriage context, and even as you go cross-culturally and how things are handled and dealt with, and the implications and impact. Anyway, it's just, it is like you said, it's just short-sighted.
It is, yeah.
And a lot of countries, sexuality is viewed very differently, and how it's, what they're going to be exposed to is going to be maybe even more than what they're exposed to here in the U.S., and the temptations will be even greater. So I do think it needs to be an open conversation, even in pre-field orientation and in parts of debriefing and all these things. We need to grow in this area for sure.
Yeah. Well, and something we forget about is that our brains work differently in the moment than they do when we're thinking ahead of time. So I can have a conversation about how I think I'm going to react in the field based on my past experience. But if I come across something in the field that I've never experienced, and now I'm in the moment, and those chemicals are firing in my brain, my responses are not necessarily going to be the healthiest. So when I act out in whatever way that may be, if I don't have a place to share that, then that's going to become an isolation, another point of isolation. And then that's going to degrade my experience in the field.
Yeah.
And what's going to keep me from sharing that is knowing that my life is over as I know it if I can't be a missionary again. Now, I have 2 points to that. So that means us, missional organizations need to help put together a process for restoration. Okay, if you have this issue in the field, yes, you do need to step away for a while, but we have a plan in place to help you. But on the other side, even if your missional organization doesn't have that, I go back to the saying, the fallout is worth the freedom. You are worth more getting healthy, even if you're not able to step back into the field.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's a redemption story. We care about the redemption of everyone, including our missionaries.
Yep.
And not just, I think sometimes there's this emphasis on the lost need to be reached at all expense, even if the expense of a life of a missionary that's, not going well.
Yeah.
And that's really not the gospel. We want the gospel lived out in the lives of our missionaries and redemption for them as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree.
So can we we need to wrap up, but we want to be sure and hit on things like accountability options and safeguards and things that people can be proactive about, or when they do say, hey, I have a definite concern, I need to reach out and talk to someone. So can we just chat about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, number one, just in regards to some healthy boundaries, safeguards that you can put in there, I'll throw one out that probably doesn't need my advertising, but I've fallen in love with a software called VidAngel. Many people know Angel Studios, which is The Chosen, but VidAngel is an app that works with different streaming services that allows you to filter out anything that you don't want to watch. So I love VidAngel. It's been very, I'm a movie buff, so it's been allowing me to watch some movies and get rid of junk and not be surprised. So it's amazing. There are a lot of software for protecting your internet browsing. And I would say the right one for you is the one that works. So I would say don't be married to any individual one. They all do things a little bit differently. And so depending on what your need is, that's what you should dive into. Some of the ones I really like is Plucky. Plucky is it puts more power on the individual. It helps the individual be accountable in that sense. And so I like the way Plucky works. Accountable to You is another really good one, and Covenant Eyes is another one. They all kind of work a little bit differently. But what I usually tell people is those are just speed bumps. Okay. If you want something, you're going to find it. So those are just meant to put, when you are in that hey, I want this right now moment, it's a speed bump to help you get back in your right mind. It is not the answer. So I think that's important to know. Again, support groups. There are a lot of ministries. I will jokingly tell people that Pure Life Alliance is the best one out there, but I'm biased. But you've got Pure Desire, you've got 423 Communities, Be Broken. If you're not local, there's a lot of other ministries out there. And so get support, get men and women to surround you so that you can start to work on the deeper issues that are going on. What do I believe? What are my needs? And how do I get those met in a healthy way? So those are some of the resources. And then our website has some really great books that we use, both for men and for women. So you can always go to purelifealliance.com, go to our resources and our book page and see some really different books. If you're a pastor, I highly encourage you to read Rethinking Sexuality by Julie Slattery. Another one is Unwanted by Jay Stringer is a really good read, and it tells us a lot about what's going on and how we can address it. So there is a ton of resources out there for individuals who are looking for help. But again, I would say that trying to do it alone, if you were trying to get out of the addiction, is probably the worst thing that you can do, even with all the resources. I think reaching out for community is what's best.
Yeah, we don't want lone rangers out there.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much research that talks about community settings and verbalizing a need or verbalizing, like even when on the positive side, when someone says, I want to achieve or accomplish something, when you verbalize it and say it out loud, just the greater the ability to move forward with that. And so if you're verbalizing a brokenness or an addiction or a desire to be more pure, more whole, those things have got to have a lot more power.
Yeah, it's so interesting how research often points out what the Bible said all along, which is bring things into the light.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The whole darkness and light issue just is such the motif here, because living in the darkness is where the unwanted things are growing and prospering, and bringing things into the light is so much of the healing power.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time and how this conversation, I think, will be helpful to many. And it's a hard topic, but a necessary topic. And we hope that it will really bring people hope and courage to step out and get the help that they need.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And again, if there's one thing I want people to hear from this, is just that there is hope. Like, it is a hard topic. It is a long journey, but man, the other side is well worth it. And there is freedom. So
thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, no problem. Have a great day.
Well, Cara, talk to me a little bit about this interview.
So yes, I was so encouraged, and also, it's a sobering conversation to think about how low the exposure age is, and I'm thinking raising my own kids, and just we really need to be aware and grow in our ability in the church and in the missions community to talk about sexuality in a positive way, and be vigilant about the temptations.
Yeah, I heard things about proactive conversations, talking about things, not waiting till there's an issue, not waiting till there's a crisis, but trying to address things up front. I appreciated those things. I really want to highlight something that he mentioned, and for wives, because if a husband comes out with a confession about an addiction, a sexual addiction, and how they have a support group for wives called Hidden Hurt. And that is the other half of the story, is how the wife walks through this whole issue with her husband.
Yeah. So we hope that this whole conversation just really encourages those of you who are feeling isolated and alone and stuck, and that you can know that there is help out there. Reach out, ask, look up these resources. We are posting all of the books and links and everything in our show notes, so go and look there. We want you to find help. We want you, whether you're single or married, have a teenager who's struggling, anyone who needs help, we want you to get help.
Yeah. And as Cara mentioned, there are a tremendous amount of resources. So go to the websites of these different organizations, look at their books, and look at what resources are available. And we talk about light and darkness, and this is an issue that's kept in the darkness so often. And when it's in the darkness, it has tremendous power. And so our prayer is that God will give you the grace and courage to bring it into the light.
Only bad things grow in the dark.
Only bad things grow in the dark.
So we hope that you bring it to the light, and that your life can be restored. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.